A major university is an incredible place of learning, creativity, and accomplishment. As president of Oklahoma State University, I have the opportunity to explore and experience what makes our campuses unique. I'm Burns Hargis. Come along with me, and together, let's go inside OSU. He's one of the great names in history. Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during the most turbulent of times. His leadership and an unconventional alliance with Joseph Stalin and Franklin Roosevelt led Britain and the Allies to victory in World War II. Celia Sandys is Churchill's granddaughter. She's also an author who's written many books about the late Prime Minister. Sandys recently spoke at OSU's McKnight Center for the Performing Arts. We sat down to discuss her writing, her grandfather's background, and his relationships with FDR and Stalin. When did you decide to start writing?
I was in my late 40s, and I'd had 2 children very late in life, and I dropped out for 5 years.
You had one at 45,
I had one at 45, and I dropped out for 5 years just to play babies, and had a wonderful time. Best years of my life, fantastic. But the children grew up, and so therefore I had to think what I was going to do. And at that moment I went to have tea with my grandfather's nephew, who was a cousin of mine, and we were good friends. And on the table there was a battered little tin trunk. I was obviously meant to, you couldn't not comment on it because it was so incongruous. So I said, "What is that?" And he said, "Let's have a look." And we opened it up, and it contained my grandfather's childhood letters, his parents' replies, his nanny's letters to him, his great-grandparents' diaries, all sorts of treasures.
What a treasure, yeah.
It was amazing. So I said to my cousin Peregrine, "This is wonderful, someone should do it without a single thought." And he said, "Yes, you do it," and handed me the trunk. So that was very exciting. I then rang my sister and I said, "Do you know a publisher? Because I don't know any publishers." And she said, yes, you know Nicholas Thompson at Heinemann." And so I rang him up on Tuesday, and he said, "You want to write a book, Celia? Well, you better be quick because I'm resigning on Friday." On Friday, he signed his last contract for me, so that was wonderful. So it was so exciting.
And then the books just flowed. Was it easy?
Well, the books didn't flow, but it was a wonderful subject to have. I mean, the first one was about the first 20 years of his life. Then I decided to carry on with that. But the best part of the next was his time in South Africa in the Boer War, when he was captured, and he was considered to have been very heroic and had the most exciting adventures. So I went off with my family for a holiday to launch the book there. And the public relations girl sitting next to me in the car, and I said, "How many books have we got here?" And she said, 300. So I said, "At the party tonight?" And she said, "No." I said, "In Johannesburg?" She said, "No." I said, "You mean in the whole of South Africa?" She said, "Yes." So I was really quite cross because I thought that was ridiculous. So I went up to the presenter in the television studio where I was doing an interview before this party and said, "Don't let's talk about a book, too boring. Let's try and find any descendants of people who knew Winston Churchill 100 years ago in the Boer War." The presenter thought that was great fun. So she put out this message. And when I got home that night, there were 60 replies. So I decided to stop writing a book for 14 years and to do one just for 9 months, which was wonderful. It was called Churchill Wanted, Dead or Alive.
Yeah, that's when he became well known, at least in the UK, right? I mean,
no, that is when he established himself on the international stage for the very first time, really. Until then, he was the precocious son of a famous man, but because he had an American mother and this famous father, he made the newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic when he was captured by the Boers after rescuing many, many people who had been ambushed on an armoured train. And so he escaped from the prison with a price of £25 on his head, dead or alive, very like it would have happened here, I think.
He was annoyed by that
he
amount.
He thought it was a very insulting figure. But he escaped and got back and joined the army and fought for another few months.
Was he a war correspondent at that time when he was
the most
captured?
highly paid war correspondent because he'd resigned from the army, but then he joined up in the army in South Africa. But he also was the war correspondent, so he had the edge on everyone because he was able to get every story because he was at the front of the charges.
Who were some of the most important influences in your grandfather's life?
Well, he always had a strong woman beside him at every moment of his life. For the first 20 years, as I told you, he had Mrs. Everest, his nanny, who had a huge influence on him because basically his parents, his mother was very busy with her social life and his father was very busy with his political life, and they weren't cruel parents, but they weren't what you could call attentive. And home for him was wherever Mrs. Everest was. So it could have been a boarding house by the seaside, or it could have been Blenheim Palace, but wherever she was. And she came from Kent, and she told him it was the Garden of England, and that's why he bought this house, Chartwell in Kent. I mean, he carried her with him through his life, and his whole life he had her photograph beside his bed.
We don't talk much about Clementine. I mean, you mentioned a strong woman, but and they say he made proposals to 3 women before Clementine finally accepted. But talk about your grandmother. What was she like?
Yes, but I think the proposals he made were those of a young boy who was, none
Foolish.
of them were really, well, there was one, he had one real love, but I think he was so determined on his career that he couldn't keep up with that. No, she was the great love of his life, and she was an amazing woman. And I mean, he wasn't easy to live with, and she wasn't that easy to live with, but they had a great life together. She supported him.
Was she an extrovert, or was she?
No, she wasn't an extrovert at all, but she was very determined that, but by the time the war came, she was the only person who could tell him what was what. If she thought he was wrong, and I mean, she would tell him. On one occasion, she decided to write him a letter. They wrote each other lots of letters, because obviously sometimes if you're going to tell someone something and they're not going to like it, they can shut you up before you even got past the first paragraph. So she wrote him a long letter saying that she'd been told that he hadn't been very kind, and he was in a very stressful time during the war, and she knew the strain he was under, but he must be very careful the way he behaved with everyone. And that I think this was, and she got her point across, but she'd have never got it across otherwise.
His education, formal education, was a little spotty, it appears. He said, in fact, that my education was limited only by my schooling. Not real popular in this town, but that's...
Well, I'm sure that wouldn't happen here. But he was he was a bad student, and he loved history and English. And the subjects that mattered then were Latin, Greek, and maths. And he ignored those completely. So therefore, he never passed any exams. And when he was 12, he took the entrance examination for Harrow School. And because his father had decided he wasn't clever enough to go to Eton, so he sent him to Harrow. And the Latin paper, he wrote his name and wrote the date. Then, as he said, somehow an ink blot got on it from I don't know where, and that was the extent of the paper. And he said, with that, showing that extent of knowledge, the headmaster decided that I was worthy of entry into the school. It was obviously because he was the son of a famous father. But at the school, there were 2 masters who saw the point of him. Most people didn't, because he was very precocious. But there was the English master who actually preserved some of his work, which was exceptional. And so, English was the thing that he said the stupid boys were taught extra English. And that was where he got his English. And so, and now, Harrow, he's the most famous old boy from Harrow, but he didn't leave it with great glory.
Tell us going back to global politics, tell us what he thought of Stalin.
Well, he felt that he was obliged to make an alliance with Stalin because he had no choice. He didn't like him at all, but he had to. But Stalin, he had a very uneasy time because At the end, when Roosevelt was getting ill, Stalin was manipulating the president to get him to sideline my grandfather. And clearly, Russia and America were much more powerful than Britain. But my grandfather felt that he'd held the fort at the beginning when no one came in with him. And this was very unjust, but he was in a very difficult situation. And he didn't like Stalin at all, and he hated communism. I mean, his greatest regret when he died was that the Berlin Wall was still up and that he hadn't had a good relationship with his father.
Well, talk about a little bit, I know you did in your talk, but a little bit about the relationship with Roosevelt.
Well, they had in fact met years before in the 20s, but not seriously. I think that Roosevelt had come over, but in a junior position. But my grandfather, before he became Prime Minister, was to a degree wooing Roosevelt. I don't think whether he knew he was going to be Prime Minister, he couldn't have done, but he knew he'd like to be. But so when he became Prime Minister, they'd already established a relationship. And I think they had a really good relationship, and I think Roosevelt liked him, and my grandfather liked the president very much. Mrs. Roosevelt did not like my grandfather. She thought he was a terribly bad influence and made her husband drink and smoke too much.
Well, there's that. To your knowledge, did your grandfather ever confide in you, or that he ever doubted, even privately, that England would emerge victorious from World War II?
He didn't confide in me that, but I know, I mean, he certainly, the fact of the matter is, he certainly must have, he had to have doubts, because, I mean, it was quite clear if America hadn't come into the war, we couldn't have won. And if America hadn't come into the war, America wouldn't have had a foothold in Europe. And then, well, we would certainly have been speaking German, and I don't know whether you would have been speaking German too, because who knows what Germany and Japan could have done if we hadn't all got together.
I mean, he had a lot of ups and downs in politics, but he was in it for his entire career virtually.
Oh, yes.
What would he think about politics today?
Well, he didn't consider himself a politician. If you'd asked him what he was, he'd have said, "I'm a writer." But what would you think of politics today? I think he'd be horrified by the lack of civility between the politicians, between the parties. And, I mean, you know, they were always quite rumbustious in the House of Commons, but not rude. And it's really nasty now. It's horrible.
He actually started out in the Labour Party.
No, he started out in the Conservative Party, then moved to the Liberals, and then back to the Conservatives.
I see.
And he said, "I ratted and I re-ratted."
Our Dean of Arts and Sciences would like to know what you think leaders could learn today from your grandfather.
Well, they could. What he considered that the first of all human virtues was courage. He said that is the one that controls all the others. And so he was determined to be courageous, and he was always worried that he wasn't going to be brave. When he went as a soldier in India, instead of choosing a neutral-coloured horse, he chose a white one so that he'd be noticed when he was being brave, but of course that was the most dangerous thing to do. But I think he was courageous and he believed in himself. I think it's very important to believe in yourself.
Sand spoke to a packed house at our new McKnight Center for the Performing Arts. You can watch her entire speech and our extended question and answer session on O-State TV. Sand's speech is also featured on the Inside OSU podcast. You can download and subscribe to our podcast at podcast.okstate.edu. I'm Burns Hargis. We'll see you next time on Inside OSU.